What if the most dangerous moment in a war is not the first missile fired or the first tank crossing the border, but the exact moment when stopping feels impossible? When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, neither side woke up wanting decades of destruction. The initial plans for Moscow envisioned a quick, decisive operation, capturing Kyiv within days and installing a friendly government. Ukrainian intelligence and Western analysts, however, warned that such a strategy was risky. Yet at the time, both sides operated under the illusion that escalation was containable, a limited conflict that could be controlled like a machine with a dial. In those first days, diplomacy still felt possible. Western mediators were still in contact. Russia believed a quick victory could force negotiations, and Ukraine hoped international pressure might restrain the invasion. But war has its own momentum. By the second week, the situation changed. Russian forces faced unexpected resistance in Kiev and northern Ukraine, while Ukrainian defenders mobilized civilians, territorial defense units, and social media campaigns to resist. Public statements hardened on both sides. Russian leadership framed the conflict as a special military operation to protect Russian speakers and national security, while Ukrainian leaders emphasized national survival, resilience, and the defense of sovereignty. Red lines were drawn publicly, not privately, and stepping back across them became politically and psychologically costly. De-escalation began to look like defeat, and in the eyes of both domestic and international audiences, retreat was almost unthinkable. This is what political analysts call a structural threshold. A moment where the original reason for war takes a backseat, and what dominates now is credibility, survival, alliances, and long-term strategic security. In Ukraine, both sides quickly approached this threshold. Russia feared the internal and international consequences of failure, while Ukraine feared the collapse of its national identity and territorial integrity. The conflict was no longer simply about military objectives. It had become a battle over political survival, global perception, and historical legacy. Historical parallels illustrate this pattern. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers avoided backing down publicly because credibility and internal stability were at stake. The difference today is that global media, instant reporting, and social networks amplify every move. A misstep, a pause, or a hesitation can trigger a cascade of political and psychological consequences. Ukraine has used this modern media environment to its advantage, rallying global support and framing Russian actions as unjust aggression. While Russia uses propaganda to maintain domestic support and justify the invasion, for leaders, the pressure is intensely personal. Russian leadership faces the risk that retreat could undermine domestic perception of strength, weaken internal political control, and embolden opposition. Ukrainian leadership knows that compromise could fracture national unity, embolden aggressors, and undermine morale. In both cases, defeat now threatens more than territory. It threatens the very legitimacy of leadership, the trust of allies, and the survival of the state as a functioning entity. For civilians on both sides, this escalation isn't theory, it's daily life. Air raid sirens, power outages, displacement, and loss turn abstract strategy into permanent trauma. Alliances amplify the stakes. NATO's commitment to support Ukraine signals that any retreat or compromise could have far-reaching consequences. Ukraine cannot risk appearing weak because it relies on foreign aid, training, and political support to maintain resistance. Russia, meanwhile, must consider the global perception of strength, the risk of sanctions, and the fear of emboldening neighboring states to resist. At this stage, escalation becomes the least bad option. It is not a moral or convenient option. It is the one that feels safest in the short term. Leaders convince themselves that continuing the fight, no matter the human or economic cost, is safer than retreating and appearing vulnerable. Analysts note that in repeated confrontations, restraint is punished and aggression is rewarded, a dynamic known as the security dilemma. Every artillery strike, drone attack, and counteroffensive is framed as a necessary defense, yet each response inevitably raises the stakes further. Emotion now dominates strategy. War reshapes national identity, social cohesion, and public morale. Ukrainians frame resistance as a fight for survival and honor, while Russian narratives emphasize defending the motherland, protecting Russian speakers, and restoring historical pride. Social media accelerates this effect. Every statement, every military movement, every casualty is broadcast and dissected in real time. This is audience cost theory in action. Leaders face political consequences if they fail to follow through on threats. Hesitation is perceived as weakness. Retreat is framed as betrayal. As escalation continues, exit ramps disappear, trust erodes, communication channels shrink, ceasefires become precarious because each side fears the other will exploit restraint. Data on modern armed conflict shows that once wars cross certain casualty and economic cost thresholds, their likelihood of ending drops sharply. In Ukraine, with tens of thousands killed, millions displaced, and cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Bakhmut under siege, the cost of stopping without a perceived victory has skyrocketed. Sanctions and international pressure, while intended to coerce, often harden resolve instead of weakening it. Russia faces unprecedented economic sanctions, yet continues military operations, driven by the belief that retreat equals strategic defeat. Ukraine, empowered by foreign aid and military assistance, knows that any compromise under pressure could threaten national survival. The escalation loop is self-reinforcing. One side strikes to restore deterrence, the other responds to protect credibility. Each move is framed as defensive, yet collectively, the war intensifies. Over time, the war shifts from strategy to survival. Leaders focus less on winning battles and more on maintaining morale, defending critical positions, and preventing humiliation. Every gain or loss now carries symbolic weight. Kiev represents national survival. Mariupol symbolizes defiance under siege. Donbas embodies contested sovereignty. The war is no longer simply territorial. It is psychological, political, and symbolic. Leaders are trapped by enemies, allies, domestic populations, and global opinion. Compromise feels like betrayal. Peace without a clear path for survival or credibility is politically toxic. Yet history suggests wars end only when fear is replaced by incentives for restraint. Credible off-ramps, security guarantees, and structured compromises create conditions where leaders can step back without losing face. The Cold War, Korean War, and other prolonged conflicts show that careful diplomacy allows escalation to reverse. Until such mechanisms exist, escalation continues quietly, relentlessly. Another force quietly locking this war in place is time itself. As the conflict drags on, both sides become invested not just emotionally, but structurally. Military industries adapt, economies reorganize, and entire institutions shift toward a wartime footing. Ukraine restructures its society around resistance and defense, while Russia recalibrates production, messaging, and foreign relationships to sustain long-term confrontation. Once this transformation happens, ending the war is no longer a single political decision. It requires reversing entire systems built for conflict. Experts warn the prolonged wars don't just continue. They reorganize societies, building bureaucracies and power structures that depend on conflict and resist any path to peace. At the same time, expectations harden. Each side begins to believe that time favors them. Ukraine hopes sustained Western support and battlefield pressure will eventually weaken Russia's resolve. Russia believes Western unity will fracture under economic strain and political fatigue. This belief that endurance will deliver victory makes compromise feel premature, even dangerous. When both sides expect the other to blink first, escalation becomes a waiting game, not a strategy. And in that waiting game, every pause is seen as weakness, every restraint as opportunity. The longer the war lasts, the higher the cost of admitting that the original assumptions were wrong, and the harder it becomes to stop. The Russia-Ukraine war continues not because anyone wants it to, not because peace is impossible, but because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. Every missile counterattack or statement solidifies the escalation trap. It is a war shaped by fear, credibility, alliances, and momentum, where human decisions intertwine with structural forces. Understanding this helps explain why the world watches in horror as the conflict drags on, why sanctions may not immediately work, and why temporary victories rarely end wars. It is a reminder that war is not just a series of battles, it is a complex system of political psychology, international pressure, and national identity. If you found this analysis insightful, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moments in this war do you think marked a point of no return? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive into the conflicts shaping our world.